I think we'll go ahead and jump in. So my name is Bret Schafer. I'm a senior fellow at the Alliance for Securing Democracy, which is part of the German Marshall Fund. Just to give you the sort of 1-minute overview on kind of who we are, what we do. So ASD was created in 2017 after the Russian interference attempts in 2016. So we were originally set up as a bipartisan organization. So we had a Republican and a Democrat sort of two-headed monster at the top of the org. And the idea was to sort of break down the stovepiping they saw within USG in terms of being able to communicate hybrid threats. So they were like, we have your information professionals, you have your cyber people, you have your people who are looking at money laundering, all of these different sort of malign levers of influence that are being used by bad actors. But those people are not communicating amongst each other. So we were set up to be a little bit of a hub that would hopefully break down those stovepipes. So I handle our information manipulation work at ASD. So most of what we do is looking at Russia, China, Iran in that order. Probably 60-70% of our work is Russia, 25% China, and maybe 5% Iran. And I think that probably is a pretty accurate breakdown of the threat level as I see it, or at least in terms of the capabilities of those three countries. So information laundering, and just to give you a little bit about what this workshop and presentation will be today, I'm going to do a very short sort of overview of the concepts behind it. For some, I think this will be familiar to you all. For others, it may be brand new. So I just wanted to kind of go through what information laundering is, then sort of dive into a little bit of the methods that we use to try to detect information laundering campaigns, and then spending a little bit of time playing with the tool that we are building that is in development. I will note that it is very much still in development, so it's still a little bit glitchy. You're going to find some bugs there, but we can kind of work through some actual investigations so we can hopefully kind of understand the capabilities, but also understand better the methods and the means with which our adversaries are laundering information into the ecosystem. So what is information laundering? It is a term I definitely did not create, but I think we are sort of on the front end of using it in the context of Russian influence in the West. So in 2017, 2018, I co-authored a paper with a Ukrainian who actually worked on anti-money laundering sanctions in the US government. And what he was seeing were these sort of parallels between his work working on money laundering and what he was seeing in Ukraine in terms of Russian information attempts to get information that was sort of integrated into authentic or seemingly authentic Ukrainian outlets. So we created this idea of information laundering, borrowing from sort of money laundering terminology. So the process is essentially taking a piece of information that is not particularly credible and laundering it into a credible outlet so that it has a greater impact, or at least an outlet that is well known. So this is the sort of typology that we had when we were breaking down what this actually looks like. And again, this is borrowed heavily from money laundering. So first is this idea of placement. So what's the problem if you are a drug dealer, if you are someone who's in the sort of illicit weapons sale business? It's not hard to make money. It is hard to get that money into a legitimate financial institution. So what they first need to do is place that money somewhere in the banking system, often through a shell company or a shelf company. It's just a way of getting that money actually placed somewhere where it can kind of move through the financial ecosystem. Then there's this process of layering. One of the terms he uses is called smurfing. So instead of showing up at Bank of America with a bag with $10 million in cash, you want to make these small transactions so it doesn't sort of trigger flags within the banking industry. So what they do is this process of smurfing, which is making all of these little small transactions to other intermediary banks so that when it does filter into the Bank of America account, it looks more legitimate because they're seeing all of these smaller transactions and not this one big lump sum. And then there's that final point of integration. So now the money is in a legitimate banking system. You can take advantage of it. So information laundering works in much the same way. If you're a Russian intelligence agent, not that hard to create a piece of disinformation or a disinformation narrative. Hard to get that information into an outlet that the target audience trusts, that they would see, that they would be likely to believe. So the first point is just placing it somewhere into the information environment. I mean, this can be done through 1,000 different means. You could do it through anonymous Twitter accounts, through a blog, through sort of carve-outs and cutouts and proxies. But of course, the problem with placing it in a totally obscure outlet is nobody's going to really see it. But when we often look at these campaigns that are caught, whether they're caught by Facebook or whether they're caught by independent researchers, people will often look at the outlets that have been created and sort of dismiss the campaign by saying, well, this is like an obscure outlet. Nobody saw this. This Twitter account had 500 followers. Doesn't matter. We look at that as being essential, though, because there has to be some place where you first place this information. And it really doesn't matter because of the way information flows across the internet. Once it's placed, you then layer it. So you get a bunch of different accounts to spread that information. Again, this can be used through bots and trolls, but it also can be used through websites that you create. Sort of faux local news sites, independent blogs. At some point, real people are probably going to pick up on it and do the work for you. As an intelligence agent, that's the ideal scenario, because now there's a degree of authenticity there. You're getting real people that start spreading your information around. So it's this smurfing process. So now you're seeing all of these different citations that the one legitimate outlet that you want to get your information in can eventually source or cite. So once it hits the Fox News or the CNN, oftentimes they're citing the intermediary. So you sort of have this increasing level of credibility, hopefully, if you're trying to run a disinfo campaign, of getting this inaccurate, false piece of information to continue to kind of move through the ecosystem, get it into some outlets, finally get it sort of layered into a major global publication, and at that point it just is going to take off on its own. Even if it is being refuted, it's now out there, people have to counter it, you've done the work. So that's kind of the idea behind information laundering, is it's taking a less credible piece of information, getting it into a more credible outlet. Why is this problematic? The fundamentals of media literacy are knowing the source. I mean, that's what we always sort of teach. Day one is you need to understand the source of your information. If, however, the content is actually being sourced from somewhere else in a very untransparent way, that really makes it challenging when you're teaching people to trust sources, to look at the sort of credibility of sources, their history. And so this process really obfuscates where information comes from, because we know outlets consistently are just citing each other. There's just a whole bunch of sort of, not necessarily plagiarism, but let's say loose sampling of information sourced from other places. So this will be very familiar to people like Jeff, but just to give you a little bit of a history of information laundering, because this has existed way, way before the internet. So the classic case called Operation Infection, I know many of you will know this, but of course the Soviets tried to spread around the developing world this idea that the US government had created AIDS as a bioweapon. So somebody in Soviet intelligence came up with this idea, decided it would be damaging for US credibility, but they had a problem, of course. They couldn't run this through TASS. They couldn't run this through a Russian state media outlet. It would be immediately dismissed. So they put it in a newspaper in India called The Patriot. It was a KGB cutout. So they just got it placed. Now, this newspaper had very low circulation, wasn't that influential, but once it was out there, slowly you had other outlets around the world that would pick up on this over time. And they had to do this through leaflets, through other sort of cutouts that they were financing in Africa. And so over a course of many years, you had this sort of snowballing effect of new outlets picking up on the story. At certain points, Russian state media outlets would cover it because they would say, here's this story in a newspaper in Ghana. We're just covering what they're saying. And then it would keep kind of moving and gaining a kind of new twist and a new flavor as it moved from country to country. Somewhat ironically, these narratives are very much in circulation today in a different way. I've been doing this work full-time 7 or 8 years. I think I've done 8 different bioweapons, biolab campaigns So the life cycle of this original story is now decades old. But this took time, and it took money, and it took resources, because they had to create newspapers. They had to drop leaflets. You had to have people on the ground. It was a little bit of a challenging process to pull off if you did not have a nation-state budget. But about 6-7 years after this original piece of disinformation was placed in the Patriot, it finally showed up on the CBS Evening News. So it was covered by Dan Rather. Of course, it was covered in a way that he was attempting to refute it, but it had finally hit that point of integration because everyone then covered it. And so now, even though that these people were trying, the credible outlets were attempting to debunk it, it's out there, it's gained this degree of credibility. And so the Soviet intelligence operation has effectively done what it set out to do. But again, this took a ton of time, it took a ton of money. Now this can be accomplished in days, hours, for almost no money. And so you clearly do not need a nation-state budget. You just need to have a little bit of technical sophistication, but not a ton. Not a ton of money. You set up a couple websites, a few bot troll accounts, and you can accomplish this with little resources, little time. And the scale and the speed at which it can move makes it very tough for those who are trying to refute these falsehoods because it jumps so quickly. So, modern information laundering, how would you now go about placing content if you were attempting to obfuscate the source of it? So, one way that the Russians have started to use as a result of EU bans is just creating mirror sites. So, of course, this appears to be RT, so they're not trying to obfuscate essentially the source of it. This is more attempting to bypass or circumvent platform restrictions and bans. So you're just looking at an RT web page there, but you are not actually looking at RT. You're not looking at that domain. If you can see it up there, the domain is swinter.site. It's just a mirror site. People aren't going there, but search engines are also not blocking it, and they're not geo-blocking it. So if you ran a narrative through a search engine, because maybe you encountered it on Facebook or Twitter, said like, what's this about? You know, some Zelensky piece of disinformation. If you ran something that was textually similar, you would not get RT or Sputnik if you were in the EU. But you would get swinter.site because it is not part of the geo-block list. So that's an easy way. Just set up mirrors. And they can spin these up constantly. So if they get shut down, another one's up in a matter of minutes. The other way, and I think this has been discussed during this week with the doppelganger campaigns, is to try to get it into an outlet that appears to be a credible, respected news organization, academic institution. So this is actually an Iranian info op that was caught a few years ago. And what you see there is actually the legitimate website for the Harvard Kennedy School. So it's belfercenter.org. The Iranian op set up a page that looked absolutely identical. It's Belfer Center, but it's belfercenter.net. So you just do essentially, I mean, this wouldn't technically be called typo squatting, but it is a version of it. You can change top-level domains. So often if you haven't registered a website before, what you should be doing if you want to protect this is you register every possible variation of it so that bad actors can't sort of use your name to set up a site that looks identical, slightly different, very easy to confuse people. If you're scrolling through your phone, most people are not going to notice that there's been a slight change here. The other way they do it, of course, is just small typos. I mean, we know scammers have done this for decades. They know that some percentage of people when going to Amazon are going to have a letter that they enter incorrectly. You land there, you get a little bit of ad revenue. Same thing can be used by bad actors trying to run an info laundering campaign. One of the more common ones, and one of the ones that we really focus on because I think it is potentially the most problematic, is the use of these faux local news sites, faux regional sites. So the Tennessee Star there is part of a wide network of sort of politically motivated sites that appear to be these sort of authentic replacements for the news deserts that have cropped up over the past decade as the news business has just been battered, especially at the local level. So we see this being used by sort of partisan figures who want to push certain political agenda, but again, through an outlet that just appears to be your local news replacement, giving you sports scores and weather, which it will do, sourcing it from other places. SouthAfricaToday.net is actually the website where my sort of fascination with info laundering began. Because as you can imagine, doing the work I do, we occasionally get rather unpleasant coverage in RT or Sputnik. And we have media monitoring that we'd use. We would see an RT article, and the next day it would be all over places like SouthAfricaToday.net, verbatim. So you have these sites that are just sourcing content directly from other places. Could be state media, could be extremist sites, could be legitimate sites, but it's just copy-paste. But done in a way, of course, if you're going to SouthAfricaToday.net, you're reading the Russia section. You have no idea that all of these articles are coming directly from Russian state media. So it's relatively effective. So the information laundromat, and we will get to the tool in a bit, but I wanted to kind of first walk through the methods that we use and also sort of the thought process behind what we wanted to build when we were first thinking of creating this tool. So what the information laundromat is it is a tool that essentially automates the investigative work that we used to do to identify mere proxy and malicious websites. And we do that through two different approaches. One is by trying to detect content similarity. It's relatively straightforward. You have a news article. Where did this news article come from? Has it been verbatim or nearly verbatim copied from another source? How do you detect that? And then the other way is through identifying technical indicators on sites, and we'll talk a little bit about that. So there's this idea of website fingerprinting, and to be completely candid, there are probably people in this room who know more about this than I do. I am not the tech person on the team. But the reason we focus on websites, well, there's two reasons. One is that websites are still sort of the scaffolding of the internet. Even though we look at like how information moves across social media platforms, it's often still citing news articles on websites. So yes, we want to identify fake accounts, but those accounts are often still sourcing material from websites. The real reason, though, is that websites leave behind clues that we can actually investigate. So going back to 2017, we are getting a lot of media inquiries all the time of like, hey, I found these 5 sites. They seem to be parroting Russian lines. Or not sites, sorry. 5 Twitter accounts. They're parroting Russian lines. How can we tell if they're Americans, which they're presenting themselves as, or if they're Russians? And I said, talk to Twitter. No idea. Like, we can't do it. We can look at certain clues. Yes, we can look at like, does the content seem aligned? But that doesn't get to attribution. We could look at the time of day they're posting. But a social media account, you have very, very little evidence kind of behind that account because, of course, only the platforms have that. Websites have to register. If they want to monetize their activity, they have to have things like AdSense IDs. So there's a lot more clues we can find from websites that give us really hard evidence to investigate. So all right, I wanted to kind of run through an actual case study here, which we did as we were developing the tool that we will get to using in a bit. So this is a case that looks at how RT content is being repurposed into faux local news sites. So we ran this investigation actually when I was in Amsterdam. So we were in the EU. We would not have been able to find this content on RT. And so, if you can see at the top, this is coming from swenter.site, but it is an RT article. The article itself doesn't really matter, but it's the story of the classified documents that were found in Biden's house and office and Edward Snowden commenting on them. So we had a bit of textual clues to go on when we tried to look for republications of this story that would appear in the EU, obviously not on Russian state media. So we did what you would do to start an investigation typically, and just went to Google and Bing and just ran sort of variations of the headline, but also just kind of Googling around the topic to see what was there. And as you can see, when we enter Snowden Biden docs, we get 3 sites there that are running a nearly identical story. The first 2 are coming from a thing called the Big News Network. I'll talk about that a little bit later. That was known to us. This is a global aggregator. There's about 550 sort of faux local, regional, national outlets just source content from elsewhere, heavily from Russian and Chinese state media, but it's like quasi-transparent. The third, though, if you can read this, is from a site called Little Rock AR News. Little Rock AR News we did not know, so we went there. It appears to be just sort of a local news site. You have an author who's attached to the story there. The original RT article did not have an author, because they normally don't have bylines except for op-eds. But we saw in reading it that essentially the story was the same. There's this seemingly local American journalist named Judy Allen who wrote it. One of the problems with Judy Allen, however, this was maybe 7 in the morning. By that point, she'd written something like 450 articles that day, which, like, even in the digital world and the pressures on journalists, like, that's prolific. Then we did a search for Judy Allen. Quite quickly, it became clear Judy Allen doesn't exist, but I give them credit. It's a common enough name that there are a lot of Judy Allens. The image is not a real person. It's a GAN-generated image. So this is AI. You can't reverse image search and lead back to a person. So pretty quickly, we felt confident that this obviously is not an authentic site. But blended in with this sort of geopolitical content, and we ran other tests to see almost all of it was coming from RT, you were getting like Little Rock News. You were getting some sports scores about University of Arkansas football. You were getting the local weather. All of the international content was being sourced from RT. So we then started noticing something that was a little bit odd in the article that was in Little Rock AR News. It was basically identical, but there were words changed throughout. So does anyone here know why they would change words throughout an article if you're running a laundering? Yeah.
I think it's because it's harder than to detect. Like if you use keywords, you won't detect the other one.
Yes. And Google, the good search engines, they have plagiarism detection because they don't want low quality results. When you search for something, they don't want 50 republications of the same thing. So they know what was published first because whatever they would do to sort of index things and crawl. And so they're going to downrank things that are identical, that appear to be plagiarized. So if you change enough of it that you get below, I think it's sort of a 70% threshold of being original, you have a better chance of showing up in search results. This is something the Russians know, by the way. In the Mueller indictments, when they were able to get internal Internet Research Agency documents, there are documents there. There's a search engine optimization person who is on staff who talked about that being part of the process at troll farms, is they had people changing enough words that the percentages would be original enough it could show up in search results. It wouldn't be downranked. It wouldn't be caught.
Bret, that was a job being done by actual human beings. It wasn't AI thing that was changing stuff.
At that point. It's a good question. Thank you for teeing me up for that for later. So there was a person who would get an article and physically have to go in and rewrite it many different ways. So again, time consuming. You're having to pay someone, you're not paying them well, but you can't scale that as well as you can do now. So, this is jumping ahead a little bit, but it's the perfect timing for it. With ChatGPT, you wouldn't need to do what they even did here a year and a half ago. We did this investigation in January of last year, where like ChatGPT had just come out, and we sort of recognized that this is going to be obsolete in 2 months. Because what this site was doing is it just had synonyms that they used with all of the articles that they would ingest. They would pass it through a system. Synonyms would replace certain words. Because if you read it, it doesn't actually make sense. So they changed classified materials to delicate supplies. Some of them you wouldn't notice. They changed before to earlier than. That's easy. But when you're doing a sort of automated system like that, you're going to get some funky results that if you're actually reading the article, you'd recognize something's off. Now with ChatGPT, you just run this through ChatGPT and say, rewrite this 150 different ways, and we're in a bit of trouble in terms of detecting it. So in looking into Little Rock AR News, we weren't quite sure if this was something that was somehow connected to Russian intelligence, or my personal thought was it is probably just a money-making scheme. RT articles are clickbaitable. They don't care if their content is being plagiarized because they just want it amplified. And so my thought was probably this is part of a wider network that is trying to monetize stolen content. But to do that, you need to run it at scale. So we said, where else can we find this article? Now using the changed headline. So now that we know they've changed words, we ran that instead of the original. And that led us to Albuquerque breaking news. We have another nice new author here. Jacqueline also doesn't exist, GAN-generated image. But these are the only two sites we could find running the content and the changes in content. And we still thought there's got to be more here, because financially this is not paying off when you look at the traffic. They're making maybe 30, 40 bucks a month. It's got to be bigger, but we kind of hit a wall.
It's interesting, Bret, too, that they just used the exact same language to describe the individual.
Yeah.
The exact same word, the search. And that for me seemed like a little bit of a clue. It was funky language. Working, performing their duties.
This is also why I never thought that this was an Intel op that was sophisticated. Like this was done in an automated way to scale it and not really to protect their tracks. It was to make it appear unique enough to bypass Google, but not to fool target audiences, is my opinion. Yeah?
I had a question just about why the assumption pre-ChatGPT that you had to do it manually.
You wouldn't necessarily. We know at the Internet Research Agency there were people there who were, but this system is automated for sure. This is pre-ChatGPT, but there were obviously other things that were available, but they were probably not as well known to not sort of the more sophisticated actors in this space. But you're right, there were options. You didn't have to pay some guy 25 cents, per article to rewrite. Yeah.
Your primary interest in this was to map out chains of dissemination. So,
Yeah, but this was sort of an early case study to see what would be the best methods to detect this. This particular network, irrelevant. It doesn't exist anymore. These sites are gone. They're off the internet. So this is more of how do we detect larger networks without just relying on Google searching an article over and over and hoping that's surfacing enough things. Yeah.
I think that the operation was quite automated.
Mm-hmm.
You see also the theme is identical on both different sides with different,
Correct.
similar names, different domain in the end, but the theme is 100% the same on the example that you show us.
Yes. Yes. But this is typical. It's not typical if it is a very targeted, Iranian, Russian, intelligence-connected influence campaign. If you're trying to run a sort of monetization clickbait campaign, they're going to automate, right? Because otherwise it takes a ton of time to set up a unique website, so you just have a template. It's one of the things that we started focusing in on in terms of how do we uncover connections between seemingly unconnected websites, is that in most cases, there is a process that people use to set these up. It would be automated because they want to sort of cut down the time it takes to create wholly unique websites, which takes some development time. So then we try to kind of dig a little bit deeper into the metadata of the site. So for those in the room who've done domain level investigations, this has become significantly harder after GDPR, for good reason in many cases. I mean, there are many reasons why you would want to mask the owner of a particular website. But it meant that when we searched whois data, we really didn't get anything useful here. The only points that we found between that Albuquerque breaking news and Little Rock AR news that were identical was where the site was registered. But I introduced this with a large caveat because there's been public reporting that has sort of spuriously attempted to say that these sites are run out of Iceland, for example, and we have figured out that there is some network running fake news sites out of a certain city because we found this registration data is identical. This is clearly a privacy protection service. So while these two sites were using it, thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands are going to have this same exact registration details. Still a clue, because there are a lot of services you could go to. So the fact two sites that seem to be the same have the same registration details, like that's interesting, but it is not conclusive. And on a lot of this work, when we start talking about the website fingerprinting and the metadata, this is where you get some bad reporting from people who don't quite understand how to run domain level investigations, because there will be similarities between sites that are entirely not connected. And there have been some prominent reports that have not understood that. And so they've connected sites based on registration data that's shared by thousands of sites without sort of realizing that. So anyway, we hit a bit of a wall here other than finding this one clue. They use the same service provider. What they didn't do, and this gets back to your comment about this being automated, is that they changed almost everything on the site slightly. I mean, the template was the same, but they used different pictures, they used different authors, they had different widgets in some cases for for weather. My guess is they just got lazy or made a mistake and didn't change the Our Team section. So the Our Team is identical between the two sites. Again, these people don't exist, GAN-generated images. But when we had that, we could run this Our Team section in these names, and that led to 180 faux local news sites operating in the US, all of which were sourcing their international content from RT. Now, I don't think these sites, individually or in the collective, were greatly influencing American opinion on things. These were low trafficked, so to be very clear, this individual network I don't think should be a, frankly, holy shit moment. Local news has been taken over by RT, but you could do this better and eventually get to the same point where you are having credible, seemingly credible outlets, a wide network of them, sourcing content from Chinese state media, Russian intelligence, partisan outlets, in ways that are entirely untransparent. So, wanted to pause from me just talking, since this is obviously a workshop, and take 3 to 5 minutes, and if you have phones or computers, this would work on it, and go to a website and just sort of put together what clues you would look at a certain at this website, which is Albuquerque Express News. You can look at the specific URL if you want to, but I know it's kind of hard to take that directly from it. You can run that article headline there, and just take 3 minutes at Albuquerque Express News to sort of poke around on the site. I promise it is actually safe and free of malware, at least as far as I could tell. Poke around and see what clues you would find on this site to start an investigation to see if it was part of a laundromat network. All right, maybe just one more minute and then we'll jump in. Okay. Anyone find anything there that would be sort of a good lead generation? Yeah.
I want to try an out-of-the-box one. There's no ads.
This is a really interesting thing when we look at networks, when we look at motivation. How is a site being monetized is a good clue. And when it's not being monetized at all, that's also a good clue. Because if you're running a bunch, it's one, if you've got a blog and it's a passion project, whatever. But if you're running 550 websites and you have no ads, what's the motivation there? So that is an interesting clue. Yeah, anyone else find anything on this site? Yeah?
They've dispensed with the little vignettes about the reporters, but Robert Besser, he should get an award for how many articles he's writing.
Yes. Robert Besser is another one that I'm quite certain doesn't exist. Yeah?
On the main page, you can click like the top banners. If you click the network banner, it takes you to MidwestRadioNetwork.com. It's a local newspaper portfolio. There's the affiliated Europe Herald, the Asia Bulletin, the Asian Pacific Star, the Herald Bulletin, the Europe Sun,
Yeah.
Central Asia Time, at least Star.
So,
Yeah, that was a
so this in some ways is a relatively easy example to uncover because Albuquerque Express is part of the Midwest Radio Network, which is part of the Big News Network, which I showed you earlier, which is located between, its offices are in Australia and Abu Dhabi or Dubai, and runs 550 of sites like this globally. The Illinois Intelligencer, all over the world, they have these sites. This site, again, is like quasi-transparent, right? It does have an about section that will lead you to it. But many sites that operate like this wouldn't have that. And so it would be a challenge to find that information that's part of a wider network. But of course, in this case, that is the biggest clue, that it sort of tells you that it is part of this aggregator network. It would depend which article you went to, if you went to articles. But you'll see this article, which is how I found this site, which is columnist calls for depoliticizing COVID-19 origin tracing. Now, it does give you a little tiny byline here. It's Xinhua, it's Chinese state media. So technically, this is sort of above board because they are citing the fact it's coming from Chinese state media. Most people who are coming to this site are probably not going to know what Xinhua is. So I would say it's not fully transparent. Of course, in search results, if you're skimming through, you wouldn't have that detail. But frankly, this is a problem. This is a wider problem with sourcing content from other places and aggregators in ways where you can't tell the original sort of creator of a piece of content. So this is Chinese state media, a Chinese state media article, verbatim. But again, many sites that sort of operate in laundromats of state-backed propaganda are not going to give you that byline. They will give you a Robert Besser byline. And I frankly don't know with the Midwest Radio Network and with BNN why sometimes they give you sort of a faux journalist and sometimes they actually do cite the fact it's coming from RT or Xinhua.
There are some where there is no affiliate, it's straight out of the West, and
Yeah.
right, for instance, and there's nothing else about the original source. Because for lack of credits, they seem inconsistent.
They are inconsistent, and I don't know why that is, honestly. Like why they are quasi-transparent some of the time that they're sourcing from state media outlets. Sort of weirdly, they occasionally do actually have VOA articles in there. So I'm not, I don't think there's really like a geopolitical motivation here. I don't know. Was there anything else anyone found on the site? Yeah.
I tried to find this Unuki guy, and I just found other fake articles referring again to this
I'm
wrong Unuki.
I'm glad you found that. I've had an obsession with this for a while. That's directly from Xinhua. I'm very, very sure Xinhua, especially in Africa, CGT in Africa, is using a wide network of fake analysts because you just can't find them anywhere other than in other Chinese state media articles. And this Sweba guy, I have a friend in Tanzania, and I became sort of obsessed with proving this. And I was like, I know you don't have access to databases, but like, can you kind of Google this? And he's like, well, first of all, this is like not a real name. It's like the kind of name that somebody who's not from here would say like, oh, this sounds like African. But he's like, it's not a Tanzanian name. And so I think Chinese state media, the embassy there just invented him. And we see that quasi-regularly in Chinese state media. They got caught once. They created a Swiss virologist named Wilson Edwards, not the most Swiss-sounding name, but the Swiss embassy called him out, said no such person exists. So they do this. There's this track record. So that's a sort of unique thing to this article, and it's more of a Chinese state media thing, and they're just citing this. But honing in on specific parts of an article are often more effective in terms of trying to uncover laundromat networks because this, in theory, could be a quasi-common headline that you'd find. In other cases, it'd be more common, like US sells F-16s to Turkey. You're gonna have hundreds of outlets who run basically an identical title headline. And so it's gonna be a hard way of figuring out where people are sourcing content from, just running it. The author, if they provide it, is sometimes good, but the individuals who are quoted are great because they shouldn't be in all of these articles. Again, there's republications. But if you have very unique people who are cited, that's a good thing to search out because, again, less of a chance that that's just two different outlets, both doing reporting on the same thing, and the text appears similar.
Are you looking at the readership?
We can look at site visits, yeah. So BNN, why this is more interesting, frankly, than the first one I showed you, is this actually does show up in search results quite highly, particularly on Bing. I don't know if they have some sort of distribution agreement with them. I have no idea. But we've run multiple studies now on how Russian state media, Chinese state media shows up in search results, not looking at laundering as the focus. So we're essentially saying, the two studies I'm thinking of, we did one with Brookings a few years ago. How effective is Chinese state media at leveraging search engines to push their favorite narratives around COVID, Xinjiang, like a couple sort of key points. And what we found was relatively successful the more sort of conspiratorial you get. So around the idea that COVID was created in Fort Detrick, Maryland, for example, Chinese government pushed heavily. If you search that in Google, you got a lot of Chinese state media content. It's that sort of feedback loop. It's problematic. But this site was also showing up all the time too. So that was one of the things, not Albuquerque Express, but part of the BNN network.
So excuse how naive the question is, but can you localize the leadership?
No. I mean, there might be a way to do it, but not through the tools I have. So I wouldn't be able to say, like, okay, we can get their average site visits a month. And yes, they can kind of, I think on sites like SimilarWeb, you would see like most of this is coming from the US or China, but you can't get super local. In terms of where this comes up in search results, like we can geolocate it when we use things like SERP API to capture search results. You can say, I want to search for this in Des Moines, Iowa, and see what you get if you run like a Chinese conspiratorial piece of content. Are you sent to Chinese state media? Are you sent to these faux local sites? So that was one piece of research we did where BNN was showing up. And then we did a report that was commissioned by Ofcom, who's a British media regulator. Again, looking at foreign interference or foreign influence on search engines. This is post-invasion. And so we were looking for instances of RT showing up in search environments, which it shouldn't be because it's sanctioned in the UK. And we found that the major search engines were actually very good. And again, this is be agnostic about whether or not it's a good idea to sanction and downrank or block these sites. But it technically should, by the law. You shouldn't be getting RT or Sputnik. And they were good at blocking it. I mean, we found a few random instances of like RT India showing up. So you're 4 times as likely, actually, to come in contact with Russian state media on sites that have no affiliation with the Russian government, mainly the big news network. We found like 800 instances in our study of Russian content, Russian state media content, showing up in UK search results on issues of national security concern on part of the big news network. So this is a, I don't want to overstate how important the network is, but it shows up. It just doesn't exist in the sort of wilds of internet domains. And so it's why we focused fairly heavily on kind of trying to understand this network, to understand future networks.
Is it helpful to look for sort of odd stylistic things or clunky language? And I ask that because given the cutbacks in the media scene generally, particularly like in the US market, I mean, there are no editors any longer in
Yeah.
a lot of places, right? I mean, the quality of the language in the Washington Post is not nearly as good as it was 10 or 15 years ago. It just isn't getting edited and looked at, and I don't know what that, to do to sound like just another I don't know if people are being taught grammar as well as they were, and the quality of writing stuff. So things like clunky language and even style stuff like doing WED 20 NAR 2024 is their style. They do it again today rather than writing Wednesday 20 March. Little stylistic things. What I'm saying is that useful to look for clunky language, or because of kind of what's going on generally in the use of language, is that really not
Becoming less and less helpful, I would say. Also because if your focus is trying to look at, is this being sourced from a foreign outlet attempting to present itself as an American, and there's terminology here that just doesn't sound natural, which is how we started doing work in 2016 around Russian troll and bot accounts. You know, as you well know, speaking Russian, like they don't understand English articles particularly well because they don't exist in the Russian language, so you get a lot of problems there. Like that's gone now, because with ChatGPT and other means to rewrite content in like more or less fluent English, it's a little clunkier in other languages. So I did this presentation in Armenia, and they're like, ChatGPT sucks in Armenian. So you can definitely tell when something has been auto-translated because it's not accurate. So occasionally it can be, but less and less so as those automated systems get better. Yeah?
Do you do anything with like some of the pictures involved? One of the things, if you scroll down a little bit and the header pops up, it's the Facebook logo from 10 years ago. It's the
Yeah.
Twitter logo from 10 years ago. And plus.
That is, and one other thing, so the last thing that I was going to highlight here, when you actually do get to the social profiles are gold mines, because sometimes they're really inconsistent with the kind of content pushed out because they set up a Facebook account, it had a different sort of purpose, it got repurposed, they forgot about the Facebook thing, and it just sort of sits there dormant, but with some intelligence. But if you go to as you mentioned, if you go to the Twitter account, it was banned. So clearly, Twitter, this is pre-Elon, cared enough to actually catch that this was part of a laundering network. Yeah.
So 12 people in this room have just accessed this site and clicked around. So whoever, whatever is behind Albuquerque Express knows that 12 people have clicked. Is there anything else that is gained by them individually, or, I mean, is there
Theoretically, but probably not. The biggest reason you wouldn't necessarily want to click on a site that is monetizing clicks is you're like directing ad revenue there, but it currently doesn't seem to have much ads. But you're talking more about like micro-targeting.
Yes, yeah, and monetizing clicks, as opposed to, there are no ads, so there's no incentive to go to an ad, person and say, we get this many clicks, so how are they're monetizing clicks by saying, our fake, to a nefarious actor and say, this fake newspaper got this many clicks, we're good, we should.
I don't know how they're kind of monetizing this network, but it's still my theory that it is financially motivated. You would be more cautious about doing what you're saying, which is getting a room together, clicking on a site that might be a Russian intelligence site, because occasionally they have sort of honeypots that they set up to say, like, all right, let's see the people who are interested in this and let's kind of locate where they are. So like, in theory, there would be some security risks having a room do this if I thought that site was more suspect. But no, you're not. It's not naive and it's not wrong. You're kind of concerned about a bunch of people ping this site from one IP address. Would that sort of trigger something at headquarters? It could. I don't think in this case, but it could. Yeah. Yeah. No, you're right.
Well, yeah, in the About Us, it says, it lists an address in Dubai. So would it maybe be possible to imagine a conference suite in Dubai where they're kind of pitching the big news network as like, hey, if you give us this amount of money, we can put this amount of stories and look at these successful times that this has been quoted in, because it can go, I could imagine, as I remember back when The Onion would run stories, fake, funny stories that were very, very close to news. They stopped doing it because people started to cite them seriously, and they found that was a little bit too dangerous. But I remember that they were, or I can imagine that, it would go from one of these totally fake things to maybe a partisan source that's like, look, I've been talking about biolabs and TruePatriot.com is right, and then moves to the next thing.
Thank you for bringing that up, because that's actually a really critical point, is that these sites can be repurposed and sort of reconstituted in ways where, like right now, I don't think it's particularly, it's a particular security concern. But at some point, they could pitch that to someone and say, look, we have built up a readership. We have this wide network. We're showing up in Bing search results. We have actual influence here. You got a couple $100,000 and want to run something a little bit more targeted, like, we built you an audience. So it absolutely can change stripes and leverage the fact that it has built up an audience and credibility, at least credibility in the sense of like search results say, oh, this network's been around for 5 years. All of the little signals that they'd look at to say, yeah, we can surface this in search results.
Well, I'm imagining the same way that, I'm sure there are conventions where there are arms manufacturers saying, well, you're going to have to put down this rebellion. Our weapons are perfectly suited, for nefarious tasks, our weapons are the best.
Yeah.
Just in the same way that America runs conventions to buy products and things like that, they'd be foolish not to run the same thing.
There are 100 different bad actor motivations that could leverage something like this. It could be just spammers at a certain point too. But you're absolutely right to kind of think in that direction. That what a site is now does not mean what it will be in 5 months. We know this, of course, from shopping Twitter accounts. The Twitter accounts that were created had a certain purpose, and at some point either get hijacked or sold once they have a certain amount of followers. The same thing exists for websites. If you have a website that has existed for a while, that gets traffic, has some backlinks, it has some credibility, that is far more valuable if you're running an influence campaign than saying, let's set up Albuquerque Daily Herald today to run this, because it's not going to surface as high, it has no history, has no traffic. So I think that's a great point, actually. Let me jump back in here just to, I think we kind of covered some of the additional slides. So we can skip ahead. So just to show you another, this site, I was actually going to use this site as our sort of testing ground today. This is Florida Diary. It went down 2 days ago, which is why I went to the big news network. It's also a good reminder in OSINT work. You know, we like to say that things that go on the internet stay there forever. This is definitely not true. And you need to do a pretty good job of documenting investigations, screenshots, hopefully getting things archived in the Internet Archive, because all the time we do investigations in the websites that then just disappear. It's a great lesson, and it is a lesson I will tell my daughters when they're like 16, that what you put on the internet stays there, but it's actually not true. So we covered this already, but again, Florida Diary was another one. It's running RT content as all of their geopolitical content. But I think we sort of already covered this to a degree of how to determine whether a piece of content is original or repurposed. But we should actually go, I mean, without a tool at your disposal, what would be the methods that you'd use to try to see if this article was sourced from somewhere else or was appearing somewhere else? I mean, the low-tech one, the way we started it, we Google it. We use a bunch of different search engines, see what's there. There are limitations with that approach and limitations, frankly, with the approach we have now that largely leverages that. So the risks of focusing on content to figure out laundering networks is one. There are occasionally times where there are legitimate reasons why a piece of content has been republished or repurposed in another outlet. I mean, the AP stories show up everywhere in local news sites. There are above board reasons for sourcing content from other places. So thinking a little bit in sort of a red teaming exercise, if you were trying to push out content that was, let's say, had political motivations, you didn't want it to be detected, so you don't want it to be identical, what would you be able to do to avoid detection? And this gets to some of the limitations of our tool that we're trying to crack. So Jeff, you already kind of hit on this. At this point, you can run it through ChatGPT. You can get the same idea, but the text is going to be 100% different. We can't deal with that right now. We're working towards it. I mean, there are already efforts that are being put in place to try to figure out when a piece of content is not necessarily textually identical, but the ideas and narratives are linked in some ways. But it's a very new field. The other big issue we have is if content is auto-translated. So we just put out a piece of research last week on RIA Novosti, Russian state media content showing up in Poland through websites. They're taking Russian content, translating it into Polish, and so it's not being caught by any of the sites, and it's not being caught by our system. Like, we had to do some work to get there. So if you translate it into different languages, especially if you do multiple translations, so translate it into English, translate that English into Polish, you're in a better spot if you're trying to avoid detection.
Just looks to me that still has a ways to go. And again, maybe I'm giving people too much credit, but anybody who does any kind of journalism training, you don't put words in like on Friday, alarming reports. You don't use the word alarming in journalism. You write reports. And again, maybe I'm too down in the weeds.
You just didn't work for RT, Jeff. But no, I mean, this one is sourced directly from it, and like there's crappy journalism that you're going to find throughout.
That first sentence is just horrible.
The issue, and this is something that I've sort of been pushing for a while, The way most of us, I shouldn't say most of us, the way some of us consume news is to scroll through headlines on a phone where we often don't click on the article. And so a sensationalized headline, a poorly written thing, you're reading it on a metro on your phone, I don't think that would sort of trigger the same kind of warning systems that you're having going off in your head of like, this doesn't read like there was an editor here. So that's more my concern. You can kind of flood an information environment. A search result is a great place. You got 5 variations of a Russian article on the same topic that are showing up in your top 10 results, and people just sort of scroll through that and say, oh, like something's going on here. I think there was a question, yeah.
What I would search here is about the bridge, and if I can find other articles talking about the same thing, and maybe showing it in different ways, but going on the same line, things like that. Like that would be one of the ways of like getting the other sources that are disseminating same or similar narratives, but in different ways. Like if you see this, like for me, this one is like not translated, something like that, because it doesn't make sense. A lot of artists, even though I'm not a native English speaker, I can tell it. But it's not like English written, it's translated. But to go beyond those tech things, then I would go to the title, to the main actor, some keywords, main things, and then I would search about that. I mean, the bridge is number 1 in my opinion.
Yeah, the bridge is one. I would also look for Zelensky's aid here. That's a little bit more unique. I mean, putting Zelensky in, you're going to get too many hits. So you're always trying to deal with balancing false positives and false negatives. It's why you need an analyst in the loop, and it can't be entirely automated, although we've tried to help. But yeah, the more unique bits of text are, or individuals, the better it is for lead generation, because you're just not going to have as many false positives as searching Crimean Bridge, Kerch Bridge, Zelensky. There's just a lot of articles out there that would hit as being similar, but actually aren't. So we already covered this. All right, because we're getting short, I'll do this very briefly just to kind of lead into the website fingerprinting. So as I mentioned in the beginning with our information laundromat tool, we have sort of a dual approach. One is trying to figure out content matches, and I'll show you in a second how the tool actually does that, but it more or less leverages search results, databases, things like that. This website fingerprinting gives us more conclusive evidence. It's more technical, so it's harder for lay people to use and understand some of the results, as we talked about with like protection service providers. You may not be able to interpret that. But the technical indicators at times are conclusive. So I'm going to ask this question, but it's probably only going to be relevant for those who have built websites and kind of understand domain level investigations. What are technical indicators that you would try to pull from a site that would be able to link 2 or more sites together? And you actually hit on one earlier, which is not conclusive, but the template that was used between those sites being identical, that would, when you get into the metadata, that would show up. And so you would see, for example, like the footers are exactly the same on these sites. They're using the same widgets. Yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say, you look at the CSS file.
Exactly. You get in the CSS files, you start seeing the architecture of sites. And again, if you're doing this at scale and you're trying to keep costs down, you don't want to build entirely unique websites. That takes a lot of time. So you build a template. You swap out Albuquerque breaking news for Little Rock AR news, for Los Angeles daily news. A couple pictures get swapped, but like the scaffolding of the site remains the same, and that would be detected. Are there any other things you could think of that would be conclusive in looking at the data of a website?
Is it about the host? Well, it's another
The host,
like when you put the database of the website, like HostGator or other places that you can buy it, then probably you would go and use the only one with a lot of websites in that case.
exactly. So that, again, is not going to be conclusive. because you're going to have a lot of websites using the same service providers.
Service provider.
However, if you're looking at 2 or 3 sites, and there's multiple different service providers because they've registered the domain somewhere, they've got a DDoS protection service, if they're using the same service providers all the way through, that's good evidence. We think about it sometimes of like prosecuting a criminal case. There's evidence that is conclusive. You've got the fingerprint, you've got the video, and there's evidence that is a little bit more circumstantial, but you build enough pieces of circumstantial evidence, you could prove the case. So that would be one. A couple of the best ones get to the monetization aspect of things because people need to be paid somehow. Again, if their motivation is making money, sometimes it's not. So if you're running Google Ads, you have a Google AdSense ID. Only one person or entity should have that ID. So if you're seeing the same Google AdSense ID across websites that seem to be entirely disconnected, that is a very, very good piece of evidence that would stand up in court. The other thing is a lot of these sites try to sort of fundraise or do sort of crowdsourcing or crowd fundraising. So if you're using a crypto wallet, that's unique. So again, if it's the same crypto wallet being used across a network, that is very, very, very good intelligence that one person or one entity is behind it. So what we did is in creating our site, we created these sort of tiers, which again, we were thinking about if we were a prosecutor going into a courtroom, we have evidence between sites, like what's a strong piece of evidence, what's a weak piece of evidence. And so there are these sort of conclusive or close to being conclusive data points. The AdSense IDs, the analytic IDs, the crypto wallets. And again, I'm not the person who you're going to want to ask the sort of technical details of some of these things. But only one person or one entity should have these sort of individual data points. And then there's the sort of associative, which put enough together are good. And the tertiary, which hundreds of thousands, if not millions of sites could have, but occasionally we find good pieces of intelligence there. So now I'm going to kind of finally get to the tool, which I didn't want to spend too much time with because I wasn't sure if it would actually work this morning, but it does appear to be working. So again, if you can access a site, I will say it doesn't work particularly well on phones right now. So this is still beta version, but this is our information laundromat tool. And so it gives you the ability to search by content. It gives you the ability to do sort of a metadata scan and then run a batch. So essentially, I've got 1,000 RT articles. I want to run them all at once. Yeah?
Oh, sorry. On the technical thing, the last minute you had, I was trying to search what I was right. The HTTPS certificate is pointing to another site that said they responded with the certificate for irishsun.com.
Irish Sun is part of the network. Yeah.
So they're all using a common HTTPS certificate.
Exactly. And so one of the things in thinking through this from more of a philosophical standpoint than technical is like you're going to have 2 different kind of people running a laundering campaign. One would be people who have financial motivations, who if they're running it at scale, they want to minimize the amount of time it takes them to create a site, so they sort of replicate things, so you find those similarities. The other is a very sophisticated person who's working, for example, in the FSB and actually is attempting to cover their tracks, would take the time to cover their tracks to the extent possible. There's still some patterns usually in how those people would operate. And first of all, sometimes they just make mistakes. In a lot of our investigations over the years, we've found things that have been frankly confusing because it's like, why was this left here? And oftentimes I think we can get wrapped up in like thinking of how they're trying to confuse us. And I'm like, it's a guy who's working a 9 to 5 and it was 4:58 and they got sloppy. So there's sloppiness and there's also just this sort of human impulse to create patterns. Like I've registered these websites here, I know how it works, I'm going to keep doing it. Yes, I'll change a bunch of things. I clearly won't leave my name or address on the site, but there'll still be patterns there. So in the laundromat tool, what you can do, and just for now, this is not going to be the domain eventually, but it's a disinfo.id. So I have a RT article here. Again, the article doesn't really matter. I can take the URL, go to the laundromat, and just run a search here. It takes a minute, so I already ran the search for it just to make sure that we didn't get stuck with any sort of spinning wheels. And so what it spits back is this list of sites that have run identical or nearly identical content. The way we do it, it's not magic, it's very low tech. All we're trying to do is sort of minimize the time that a researcher would have to spend going to every single search engine, querying what's called the GDELT database, querying plagiarism detection tools. So it's all of the different ways that we, without the benefit of a tool, used to run investigations that we can do in one click now. And then we provide the sort of match score there, which we're just using sort of pairwise detection to say that these things match completely. Like this is definitely verbatim repurposed content. And as you go down, you'll get a little bit weaker. In some cases, very weak, where they're not hits because they're things that have showed up in a search result, but they're entirely different. The other thing that we provide here are these little indicators that show that these are part of lists that have been published. So like Russia adjacent lists was published by somebody saying that these sites have frequently shown up as republishers, so it's a known. As an investigator, you don't really need to spend your time here because we know what this is. And so on down the list, if it has been discovered by someone else, we'll sort of give an indicator here. But clearly in our database, we don't have anything on prophecyupdate.blogspot.com. So maybe that would be a jumping off point. This is sort of in the weeds. Weirdly, the sort of fringier search engines often give us better results because honestly, Google does a pretty good job of getting rid of the plagiarism sites and the laundering sites. So that's why we have DuckDuckGo gives you some. We also run it through Yandex. Yandex is frankly not as good as Google, and that is helpful for us because it sometimes it surfaces things that are fringier. But that's all the sort of content matching does. You can run a URL, you can run a snippet of text, you can run the headline, and it's going to give you the matches across multiple search engines, databases, with a little bit of intel behind it. The other thing that we can do, going back to our friends at Albuquerque Express, you can take the domain. And again, I already ran this just so that we're not stuck here, but can go to the metadata similarity and run the full domain through. And then we're going to show you all of these indicators here, which show what's unique about the site, and then how are these sites similar to others that have been identified and part of our database. So because Albuquerque Express, part of the Big News Network, which we've already identified, you would get all of these hits. But what you can do is, let's say, I found Little Rock AR News, I found Breaking News Albuquerque. I probably shouldn't have picked two Albuquerque things. Those are different, entirely unrelated. You can run those two sites together, or at the same time, and you would see the matches between them. That would give you a little bit more evidence of, at a technical level, there's just a lot of overlap here that would be suspect. So with the last few minutes we have, if you can, play around a little. So if you can run an investigation, sourcing content, whatever your interest is, so maybe a Chinese state media Xinhua article, see where it's showing up. You could also run an RT in Espanol and geolocate. I'll show you how to do that. If you're running the content similarity, we do have the ability to geolocate your search here. So if you want to say, okay, RT in Espanol, we know RT in Espanol does extremely well in Latin America. Where is that being republished in the El Salvadorian or Guatemalan ecosystem? You can only choose one. And you can also choose Spanish as the language. So just letting you know there's some customization there so you're not kind of querying. Spanish would work relatively well, but if you're using a language like Ukrainian, you're not running this search in the US in English, which you're going to get less interesting, reliable results. So yeah, if you want to take time for 5 minutes, it could be an extremist site, it could be a far-right site, it could be Chinese state media, and just poke around for a bit. And frankly, if it breaks, that's also helpful for me to know. But yeah, I'll give you 5 minutes to kind of play around and see what comes up, and then we can wrap things up here.
What is batch similarity?
Yeah, so batch means you're running essentially an Excel sheet of URLs at one time to save you as the researcher from individually searching. So to preview the report that we're going to put out in the next 2 weeks, we took every op-ed from RT over a year period to run them through the tool to identify the most frequent amplifiers of Russian state media content. If we had to individually run every URL, I mean, it's hours and hours and hours of work. So that's batch, it's just running an Excel sheet. Yeah. So the in-group matching you'd run if you were running multiple domains against each other, essentially. The URL scan is going to take a little bit more time, but it's just going to give you more detailed metadata. Yeah, so we don't have the sort of explainers and abouts done quite yet. All right, just because I know we only have a few minutes left and I've actually got to be on the panel at 12, so I'm going to have to jump quickly. I was hoping to give you some more time to play with this, but you can keep playing with it, obviously, if you're interested. Is there anything that you kind of ran into, uncovered, that was interesting, that was confusing, that you need?
Actually, like fewer like patches like in America.
Yeah.
Maybe they just don't need like to make other mirrors.
It's probably just not as competitive an ecosystem. There's probably just less websites there.
I mean, I put Mexico, so it has quite big population of business.
Were you running RT in Espanol?
Yeah.
No, that's interesting. Yeah. Don't know what.
They just read RT there.
Yeah, that's true. Because RT is not blocked anywhere in Latin America, maybe there's less of a reason.
It's
Or,
very popular in Mexico.
yeah. Anything else that anyone stumbled across? So just quickly, again, to wrap up, I ran the RT article and I found this sort of new website here, theburningplatform.com. This is an unknown to me, and our database doesn't have it. So that's sort of typically the process I would do is I'd run for the content match, see the domains, jump the domains over to the metadata, and see what we can find there. So now I have some leads for the future that aren't going to be conclusive because I'm not matching it against anything known. But it does have a Google Analytics ID. So if I find another site later that's also republishing RT content that looks similar, I would capture this and then be able to run them against each other. There are other clues that are definitely not conclusive. And frankly, this is our biggest concern with this site, part of the site, is like, there's zero hedge in here with a similar CDN domain, along with a few others like stateofthenation.co and Western Rifle Shooters. You could definitely have a sort of spurious match there and say like, boom, this is part of the zero hedge network. It just wouldn't necessarily be accurate. But again, there's all these little breadcrumbs that we can put together over time. We do have to have a human in the loop and an analyst who knows what they're doing looking at this stuff. But that's the hope, is we just minimize the amount of time it takes an analyst right now to be querying 30 different databases for all of these little data points that hopefully can have some matches. So I will end there just to get to the panel on time. But thank you for sitting through this. I know it's the end of a long workshop, long day. I hope it was useful.